The sound of the engine was the only thing that broke the silence of the dark night. I was driving down the empty highway, surrounded by nothing but trees, wondering how much longer until I reached the motel where I planned to spend the night. It was an eerie feeling, being so isolated, but I was used to it. As a long-haul truck driver, I spent most of my days and nights on the road, in motels like this one. Finally, the sign for the motel came into view. It was an old, rundown building with only a few other vehicles in the parking lot. I parked my truck and headed to the front desk to check in. The receptionist was an old lady who looked like she had seen better days. "Good evening, dear," she said, smiling at me. "Hi there," I replied. "I need a room for the night." "Of course," she said, handing me the key. "Room 23, down the hall on your right." I took the key and headed towards my room. The hallway was dimly lit and smelled of stale cigarette smoke. It wasn't the best place I had ever stayed in, but it would do for the night. Once I was inside my room, I quickly took a shower and crawled into bed. I was exhausted from driving and hoped to get a good night's rest, but that's not what was meant to be. Sometime around midnight, I was awoken by a blood-hurling scream coming from the room next door. It was a woman's voice, and it sounded like she was in immense pain. I jumped out of my bed, heart racing, and quickly realized that something was terribly wrong. The screaming continued for a few minutes before it suddenly stopped. I felt a sense of dread wash over me as I slowly got up and approached the door of the motel room next to mine. As I knocked on the door, I heard footsteps approaching from the other side. The door creaked open, and a man stood before me. He had a sinister look on his face. I could see blood on his clothing. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Nothing," he replied, trying to assure me that everything was fine. "Just a little argument with my wife. She's a screamer, you know?" I didn't believe him for a second. Something was off about him, and I knew it. But I didn't want to cause any trouble, so I quickly left the room and headed back to mine. I tried to calm down and go back to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had just happened. I decided to call the police and report what I had heard. But when I picked up the phone, there was no dial tone. It was then that I realized that I was completely isolated. There was no one around for miles and no way to contact the outside world. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks, and I started to panic. For the rest of the night, I stayed awake, listening for any signs of the man next door. But all I heard was the sound of my own breathing and the beating of my own heart. The next morning, I woke up early, eager to get out of the motel and back on the road. As I packed my bags and got ready to leave, I couldn't help but wonder what had happened to the woman next door. Had she been murdered? Had the man killed her? I tried to put the thought out of my mind and headed to my truck, but as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. I had put the incident behind me, but the memory of that night lingered in the back of my mind. I had gone on with my life, driving my truck across the country and spending my nights in various motels. But every time I pulled into a parking lot and saw a man who looked even remotely like the one from that night, my heart would skip a beat. One day, several years later, I was back home in my small apartment. I had decided to take a break from driving for a while and had settled into a quiet routine. I was sitting on my couch, watching a movie and eating a late-night dinner when I heard a noise outside my window. At first, I thought it was just a stray cat or maybe a raccoon, but as the noise grew louder, I realized it was something else entirely. I got up from the couch and slowly made my way to the window. As I peered out, my heart nearly stopped. There, standing in the darkness, was the man from the motel. He was completely still, just staring at me through the glass. His eyes were cold and unfeeling, and I knew that he was there to finish what he had started all those years ago. I tried to back away from the window, but I stumbled and fell to the ground. As I struggled to get back up, I could hear the man's footsteps growing closer and closer. I knew that I had to get out of there, but I was frozen with fear. Suddenly, there was a loud bang on the door, and I scrambled to my feet and ran towards it, hoping it was someone that could help me. But as I opened the door, I saw that it was the man. He lunged at me, and I stumbled backwards, falling to the ground once again. I could feel his hands around my throat, squeezing the life out of me. I tried to fight back, but it was no use. He was too strong. As my vision began to fade, I could hear him whispering something in my ear. It was a phrase that I couldn't quite make out, but it sent shivers down my spine. And then, everything went black. I woke up in a hospital bed with tubes and wires hooked up to my body. It took me a moment to realize where I was and what had happened. The doctor told me that I had been found unconscious on the floor of my apartment with bruises and cuts all over my body. They asked me if I knew who had attacked me, but I couldn't give them a clear answer. All I could remember was the man from the motel and the fear that had consumed me when I saw him outside of my window. The weeks that followed were a blur of pain and confusion. I tried to put the incident behind me, but it was always there, lurking in the back of my head. And then, one day, I received a package in the mail. It was a letter with no return address. Inside, there was only a single piece of paper with the same phrase that the man had whispered to me before I blacked out. I knew then that the nightmare was far from over. The man was still out there, watching and waiting, and as long as he was alive, I would never be safe. The letter was a chilling reminder of what happened, and it filled me with a sense of dread. I couldn't shake the feeling that the man was still out there, watching my every move. As the days passed, my paranoia grew. I started seeing shadows in every corner, and I jumped at every creak and groan of the old apartment building. I couldn't sleep, and I couldn't eat. All I could think about was the man from the motel and what he might do next. One night, as I was laying in bed, I heard a noise outside my window. My heart began to race, and I knew that he was back. I got up and slowly made my way to the window, trying to stay as quiet as possible. As I peered out, I could see a shadowy figure moving in the darkness. I couldn't make out the details, but I knew it was him. He was standing there, just watching me, and I could feel his eyes boring into my soul. Suddenly, the figure disappeared, and I was left standing there, alone in the dark. I knew that I had to do something, that I couldn't just sit there and wait for him to come back. I had to take action. I decided to hire a private investigator, hoping that he could help me track down the man from the motel. The PI was a grisly old man with a weathered face and a no-nonsense attitude. He listened to my story and nodded his head gravely. "We'll find him," he said, "but you have to be careful. This guy is dangerous, and he's not going to give up easily." Over the next few weeks, the PI and I worked tirelessly to track down the man. We followed leads, interviewed witnesses, and scoured police reports. And then, finally, we got a break. One of the witnesses we had interviewed remembered seeing a man matching the killer's description in a small town in the middle of nowhere. The PI and I hopped into his car and headed out to investigate. As we drove through the deserted countryside, I could feel my heart racing with anticipation. We were getting closer and closer to the man who had haunted my nightmares for so long. Finally, we arrived in the town. It was a desolate place with only a few run-down buildings and a gas station. We parked the car and began to search for any sign of the killer. It didn't take long for us to find him. He was sitting in a diner, sipping coffee and reading a newspaper. As soon as he saw us, he stood up and started walking out. The PI and I followed him out into the street, and I could feel the adrenaline pumping through my veins. This was it. This was the moment I had been waiting for. But just as we were about to apprehend him, the man pulled out a gun. He pointed it at us and grinned, a cold, cruel smile. "You really thought you could catch me?" he said. "I'm smarter than you, and I'm faster. You'll never stop me." And with that, he turned and ran. The PI and I chased after him, but he was too quick. He disappeared into the darkness, leaving us standing there, panting and exhausted. I knew then that the man would never be caught. He was too clever, too ruthless. He would always be out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for his next victim. As I drove back home, I couldn't help but wonder if I was his next target. Would he come for me now that I had come so close to catching him? Or would he disappear into the night, forever eluding justice? I didn't know what the future held, but I knew that I couldn't live my life in fear. I had to find a way to move on, to put the past behind me, and to live my life again. It wasn't easy. Every time I heard a strange noise or saw a shadow out of the corner of my eye, I would freeze, my heart racing with fear. But slowly, with the help of a therapist and the support of my friends and family, I started to heal. Years passed, and I moved on with my life. I got a new job, made new friends, and even started dating again. I thought that I had left the man from the motel behind me, that he was just a distant memory. But then, one night, I was home alone, watching a movie and eating dinner on my couch. The room was dark, and the only light came from the TV. I was engrossed in the movie, barely noticing the world around me. And then I heard it, a soft tapping on the window. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself that it was just the wind or a tree branch. But then I heard a voice, a soft whisper in the darkness. It said, "I'm still